Right, hi everybody. I'm glad it's 12:01 and not 12 because I always get into one of those terrible mind melts about whether or not to say good morning or good afternoon. So it's 12:01, so I can say good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to the first or session one of the commercial procurement, Welsh Government's commercial procurement net zero spring series. So we've got a number of events coming up, which I'll touch upon in a moment. But it's a very warm welcome. I can see we've got quite a number of people who've joined today, so it's really, really positive. And before I hand you over to a wealth of speakers that we've got on the call today, just to introduce myself, I'll be performing a fraudulent chair's role today. I'm Paul Griffiths. I work within the Commercial Procurement Directorate of the Welsh Government. In that, effectively, I'm here by name as the chair, but I'll be handing everything over to my colleague Kevin very, very soon, and there's very, very good reason for that. So, which we'll hear about in a second. But before we get into the presentation, on the housekeeping front, I just asked that everybody mute themselves during the particular presentations. Now, we've said here, if you want, raise your hand to ask a question, introduce yourself, name, organisation, interest. We've got 1 hour. We've got, I think we've got 4 or 5 really good speakers who've got a lot to cover in a very short space of time. So can we ask that we just use the chat function for questions? If we do have the time to answer them, we will, but rest assured we'll take them all away and we'll come back with full responses for everybody on this particular call. So I would ask we don't raise our hands for questions, and as I mentioned there, we just pop them into the chat function, which is a really good way to ensure that your questions are captured. We're recording the presentation today and we're going to publish this online. You know, we've got a really good attendance here, but I know there were quite a number who couldn't join us today, so it's really great that we can capture the combined expertise on this particular call. So I mentioned this is the first in a number of particular sessions, and we'll pick up on what's to come later on. In fact, we've already publicised that quite extensively. I think we've got a session coming up on the procurement strategy risk assessment template, but they're all framed around wider procurement sustainability with a focus on net zero. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand over now to Kevin Hammett. A lot of you will know Kevin. He's the Mr. Decarbonisation of the Welsh Government. He's been doing some tremendous work across the Welsh public sector in terms of how we can capture net zero. So I know he's known to a good number. So we're very fortunate really to have Kevin leading this event. So Kevin, I'm going to hand over to you to talk about your session, etc., and the particular speakers. And the only time you'll probably hear from me, everybody, is a little bit at the end, or you might just hear my dulcet tones if speakers are running over the 10 minutes. So it's over to you, Kevin.
I've just messed the view up I have, guys, a minute.
No, it's perfect. It's perfect. We can see it in display mode, so everything is fine there.
Excellent. Just a quick introduction then. So why Scope 3? The issue obviously with Scope 3 is the biggest challenge we're seeing at the moment, guys, because it's the indirect. Oh, I've lost. My view. Right, there's my view. Sorry. So we're looking at the 4 different areas when we have to report our emissions every year. The land is fairly straightforward, although Clive and the NRW team may argue different on that one. But buildings and fleet, however big a challenge that is, they're fairly much in the gift of the organisation to fix. Scope 3, it is the responsibility of the organisation, but it's a little more indirect and a little more of a challenge for them to deal with. In terms of reporting it, the issue we have here is how do we track something that belongs to somebody else? And why is it important? It is usually about 60 to 80% of the overall carbon footprint of an organization. So it's the biggest issue, if you like, for each one of you. But why have we put it in is if we don't add it in, actually you're losing a huge amount of your reporting responsibilities. The challenge we had, looking at the data so far, is that how did we build a system that everybody could use? So we have health boards and local authorities, and even the Welsh Government that runs into thousands of employees and massive budgets. But at the same time, we had much smaller organisations out of the 70, like a museum, for example, that may only have a dozen or so employees. So we had to build a system that everybody could use and it was practical for everybody to fit in and report on. And in order to do that, we chose the dreaded SIC coding. So I know we've had a lot of issues over the recent years dealing with SIC, and is it right, is it good, is it bad? But it is the most common and practical method that we could use for people to report on an equilateral basis, and that we could then use to compare like for like across the 70 organizations. The issue we have, is it a good guess? And I know this has been a real challenge in the last 12 months. People have criticized SIC as inaccurate. We have never claimed it to be accurate. It was always an estimate. And the purpose was really to challenge your top 3 or your top 5 issues and not try to drill down into the detail of your individual carbon supply chain footprint. And so for that reason, we built the system under 3 tiers, where tier 1 is literally an estimate, but your aspiration should be to get to tier 2 with better tools, and as you develop your processes, more accurate systems. If you could get to tier 3 and have actual carbon, that's the panacea, if you like. All I can say is this year, we've already built the toolkit with tier 1 and tier 2 in it. And I know the next one coming after me now will start to look at some of the tools that will allow organizations to better manage their actual. And we would encourage you to start using tier 2 reporting. Going forward, this is still going to be our biggest challenge, how to deal with the supply chain. And I would encourage anybody on the call today to listen to some of the other toolkit presentations today and start using them and building them into your system. That's it from me. And apologies for such a rubbish sharing, but I would suggest the next person picks this up from you. Thanks, guys.
Okay. Thanks, Kevin. And just to say, it was a seamless pickup of the baton there. So now we're going to hear from the Welsh Government Energy Service. Been doing a tremendous amount of work in the decarbonisation space. I was going to say a little bit earlier on that I don't know about others on the call, but I do get not bamboozled. That's not the right wording. We've got a lot to do in terms of delivering net zero, and it's just there's a lot going on. Where can I find out about it? And so today we're going to hear from, following on from Kevin, we're going to hear from the Welsh Government Energy Service and others. So I'm going to hand straight over to the WGES for a 10-minute, that's a challenge, project overview in terms of the work that's ongoing. And thank you for taking control so wonderfully well. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No problem. 10 minutes. I'll do my best. So hi everyone. It's Rob Hatcher from the Energy Service, and I'm just going to dive straight into it, given the limited time that we have. So last sort of financial year, we did a review on improving the public sector supply chain accounting, and the 4 key areas that we worked across are on the slide there. So we did quite a bit of work engaging with public bodies to understand what's happening, where things are going, what's not happening as well. We did quite a bit of work around the analytical side of things on the footprinting. So we did sort of national level footprinting, particularly looking at identifying, prioritising heavy emitting suppliers across the whole of the public sector in Wales, because we wanted to go and talk to them, which is the third one there. You can see that we went and spoke to some suppliers to assess their readiness to deliver on tier 3, tier 2, tier 3 reporting, and also get their insights and understand their barriers as well. And we also developed a number of strategic recommendations to support the direction of travel as well. So in the report and the things that we did, there's a lot more in there than what I can cover today. Lots of further insight around the engagement, lots of insight in there around evolving the reporting, some more of the technical aspects about how do you actually do tier 3 and tier 2 and tier 3 reporting, and some of the pitfalls and the boundaries and the things to be careful about, and a number of strategic recommendations around governance and how to organize things, move things forward from where they are at the moment. But what I'm going to focus on here is about the supply chain and what we gathered from the suppliers themselves, because we think that's an area that hasn't necessarily been well covered up until this point. And just to point out as well, the work that we did was very much focused around measurement and accounting. We didn't look at mitigation as such. So building on what Kev said around the tiered system, we took that forward and developed what we've got here is a bit more of a hybrid model to try and think about how things need to look in terms of the expectations around reporting in terms of different types of contracts over time, and using different tiers of that reporting. And the point of this slide is really to say that the hybrid reporting is going to be needed, and that's going to change and be different for different organizations over time. So we know that spend-based approach has done its job, but it has its limitations. It's not going away anytime soon, but we were looking at how do we make the tier 2 and tier 3 reporting work. So segue into discussions with suppliers, as I said, I wanted to talk about. We carried out a structured engagement with suppliers to framed against this vision that we've laid out here. Sorry, I realized my head's slightly in the way of the text there, but this vision was, where do we need to get to? So I'll just read that out quickly. Carbon management and measurements integrated into the administration, management and delivery of goods and services, and the suppliers themselves are collecting contract level emissions data. And then the public bodies are able to accurately report on their supply chain emissions, thanks to the well-established mechanisms and data sharing processes. Sounds great. What we did was basically use a needs assessment framework and went through a series of steps with suppliers to understand the needs, the barriers, and then the enabling actions to break this down. So building on this, we developed what we called the responsibility matrix, which effectively represents an overview of where the obligations for the carbon reporting cycle need to sit at a conceptual level, at least. And that's between the suppliers and the procuring organizations, and also across, or as we see it, broken down into the individual steps that need to happen to make tier 2, particularly tier 3 reporting happen as well. And we also overlaid what you can see as sort of a RACI matrix on that as well. I'm not going to dwell on that, but from the supplier's perspective, what we were saying was, you're the ones that need to do the data collection, you need to do the emissions quantification, then you need to be able to hand that over to the Welsh public sector, and then the other elements there are on the public bodies effectively. So we went through a series of engagement to consolidate the needs and understand the suppliers, explore market barriers, identify enabling actions. And then effectively during those workshops, we did deep dives with select high emitting suppliers, understand how they're doing their reporting currently and how we need to evolve that. And this really enabled us to get a detailed view from suppliers in terms of the enabling actions, alongside gathering barriers to reporting, getting their suggestions, getting their insights. So we carried out a number of workshops, and we used Slido and a few other ways to collect information. This is one of the slides just from one of those workshops effectively. So what I wanted to get into really is just to look at some of the key insights that we gathered from suppliers, and these are summarized here first of all. So what we found out was that there's definitely a sectoral variety in terms of the readiness. So certain sectors such as construction are quite mature in certain aspects, whereas the transportation sector is not. There's a diversity of emissions, which you won't be surprised here, but you know the types of emissions, where they sit in the supply chain, do they sit with immediate suppliers or not, is very different. So treating this all as one homogeneous lump in terms of supply chain is not necessarily recommended. The suppliers that we engage with are aware that this needs to get better, things need to improve. but they do have competing priorities and conflicting ambitions and targets, particularly in relation to a 2030 goal as well. So that does exist in the mix. There's an acknowledgement that collaboration is going to need to happen and improve between the suppliers and the public sector, and that smaller organisations will need some help with all of this. You won't be surprised to hear. Some of the numbers on the slide, including the ones behind me, are to do with the engagements that we carried out. So the supply chain engagement, the sectoral workshops that we did, and the plenary webinar we did with Business Wales that was focused around talking to SMEs and trying to gather their view on things as well. So to add a bit more colour to this, and sorry for the heavily wordy slide here, but I wanted to just bring out some of the figures and quotations that we gathered to add some colour. So the bullet points from the high emitting suppliers that we spoke to, 64% of those companies report on their organisational emissions and on the footprints of the goods and services that they have to some extent. 73% of those organisations are aware that things need to get better, and therefore that there's likely to be some uplifts in requirements. And 40% of those companies rated themselves as established, and that's on a perceived maturity of their own carbon reporting practices, going from foundation at the bottom to emerging, established, up to leading. And 2 companies from the construction sector believe themselves to be leading in this space. The quotations are from different sectors there. The one at the top says that the public sector, that they need to take a prescriptive approach to requesting reporting from suppliers. As much as possible, it needs to be consistent across contracts, with an understanding there needs to be some flex in the variation as well. Second quotation is public sector should ensure that all communications to suppliers are clear, simple and consistent, and suppliers should be provided with a fixed deadline for new requirements. And this is related to talking about giving a clear signal and letting them have time to go away and build a business case. If they have a deadline from the public sector, then they're able to go and get approval to put resource around doing sort of contract level emissions accounting much better. But at the moment, there's nothing there. They've got no impetus currently. And the bottom one's just from Business Wales. Sorry, I'm in the way again. It's basically just indicating that SMEs gonna need some help, and they're not really monitoring emissions at the moment. So it's a bit of a counter to some of the other information that we found out. Last slide from me. A number of recommendations in the report. A lot of them focus on the near and the medium term. We categorize them into 3 areas. Strategic planning was thinking about what needs to happen in the immediate term. So we talked about the need to create more of an enabling environment around all of this, and progressing more coordinated action across the public sector, and to think about things in a more of a sectoral way as well, given the nuances of the sectors. In the evolving practice, we have recommendations in there around really consolidating the hybrid reporting, focusing on large contracts, having much more frequent open dialogue with suppliers around all of this that isn't there at the moment, and giving them certainty around where this is all going. And then in the established, there's less sort of specific recommendations given the need to establish practices preceding it. But what we're saying is that the vision is described as tier 3 reporting is mainstreamed, is facilitated by automated, probably cloud, online-based processes, and that the focus in the latter half of this decade really should be on mitigation and action rather than getting bogged down in a lot of this accounting stuff that I've been talking about. Okay, that's it from me. No time to go through any of these appendix slides, but I'll just finish on. There's our contact details there from the project team if you have any questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Rob. That's much appreciated. So I think now in fairly swift order, she's appeared on the screen. We're now going over to Dr. Anna Jones from Natural Resources Wales. So I'm assuming you've taken full control of the slides, Anna. So over to you.
I have. It's really disconcerting seeing a small version of myself in front of the slide. Right, I'll try and get used to it and get on with it. So hi, I'm Anna. I'm an advisor in NRW's climate change and decarbonisation team. I lead on the sort of strategy behind our supply chain decarbonisation work. And this includes a recent review that we commissioned of different carbon calculator tools for use with our suppliers. So the context of this is that NRW's supply chain emissions accounted for 80% of our organisational greenhouse gas emissions last year. To make a start on reducing our supply chain emissions, for the last sort of 3 years, we've been trialling sort of different decarbonisation approaches in some case study contracts and frameworks. And then on the back of those case studies, we've developed a sort of strategic plan really for decarbonising our supply chain out to 2030. We're still in the process of sort of consulting on that internally, but basically there are two main elements to the plan, one of which is introducing tiered carbon reporting and reduction requirements for all our contractors based on the value of the contract, whether or not it's within one of our emissions hotspots. And then the other main element linked to the reporting requirements is to improve our whole supply chain emissions monitoring. So in order to improve our supply chain emissions monitoring, obviously aiming to increase the proportion of emissions data provided directly by suppliers over time. Part of our plan is that we'll be asking for contract level emissions data for our highest value contracts and for frameworks that fall within our supply chain emissions hotspot areas. So to sort of support this really, we wanted to review the role that emissions calculators could play, both sort of to collect contract level supplier data, but also to drive emissions reductions. We've already had some success using sort of calculator tools. We've introduced the EA's carbon planning tool to some flood defence construction projects. And this enables contractors to identify emissions hotspots in the build and sort of to demonstrate savings over the life of the build. So on the back of that, we were really keen to look at whether other calculators were available to sort of fill the same role for other sectors and other hotspots. So the overall aim of the piece of work that we commissioned was to review the different available greenhouse gas emissions calculators that we could use in support of decarbonising our supply chain, specifically targeted at our known sort of supply chain hotspots. So both sort of overall categories of emissions hotspots, but also the sort of specific activities that we know are driving emission sources within those hotspots. And we commissioned Ether to carry out this piece of work for us. They're just sort of finishing it up at the moment. And their final sort of report and spreadsheet will be made available shortly. So the approach they took was basically to identify as many available calculators as they could. They produced an initial long list of 65 tools. We worked jointly with them to develop a list of review criteria that we thought were sort of crucial features for any calculators that we might adopt. I'll go into them in a little bit more on the next slide. They then took that long list of tools. They identified which ones were relevant to NRW purchase types. And they took a sort of subset of 33 tools for scoring against the essential criteria that we developed. So that was the sort of first scoring step. And then the highest scoring and sort of most applicable of these tools were shortlisted for scoring in the second step against the full set of our criteria. So 9 tools were sort of taken forward to the second scoring step. And we tried to take through the best tools in each category for goods, works and services, but also generic sort of organisational tools as well. So based on the scores, Ether then gave us some advice on the best tools for use in each of our sort of broad hotspot areas. I won't go into all of these because I haven't got time to, but the sort of categories of review criteria that we thought were important were things like the emission source coverage, so scoring to what extent the tools cover the emission sources set out in the greenhouse gas protocol. their hotspots activity coverage. So to what extent do they allow us to assess emissions from our known hotspots across our goods, works and services? What type of tool is it? The price, the hosting environment, how transparent is it? Can we modify the emission factors? How resources intensive is it, both for us and for the suppliers to use? So we developed sort of a full list of review criteria, and then we had sub-criteria under each of these as well. Most of them were just closed questions with where we had to pick an answer from a possible list, and then they could be quantitatively scored, and then we added the scores across all the review criteria, and the sort of full scoring spreadsheet will be published alongside the report. So I'll very, very briefly talk you through some results for the scoring exercise of the shortlisted tools and some of their strengths and weaknesses. So just to give you some context before I do, the maximum step 2 score, so for the shortlisted tools, was 113 across all the criteria, and the maximum hotspots activity coverage was 100%, which meant that it would cover all of the emissions activities that we identified as underlying our supply chain hotspots. So there were 3 sort of generic organisational tools were shortlisted for review. The 2 Excel-based tools, the Welsh Government Public Sector carbon reporting tool, and the local government local partnerships greenhouse gas accounting tool. They both had the same hotspots activity coverage, but both had limited coverage for capital goods. The Welsh public sector tool actually scored higher in the step 2 review because it had more detailed output, because it's an Excel-based tool with sort of transparent emissions factors, and it was felt that this could be easily modified for use at the contract level. So that tool would really be most suitable for NRW in terms of calculating emissions from desk-based consultancy services and possibly IT-based consultancy services. So in terms of goods, only 3 tools relating to emissions from goods were actually identified in the long listing step. 2 of these were taken through to step 2. There were no broad coverage goods tools identified at all. So the Reading University Whole Life costing tool is a generic tool, but it has quite limited scope. It basically focuses on emissions from the operational phase. It didn't include emissions from the supply chain or from manufacture, so it wasn't, thought to be hugely useful to us. The ERA equipment calculator, it's really, really specific to the renting of plant vehicles, but it could be useful for contracts in our plant hire, plant purchase hotspot. And Ether did suggest that an alternative approach to using calculators is probably preferable for goods. So, for example, supporting suppliers to calculate their own product footprints using emission factor databases, which is obviously an expensive option, or maybe using sector average emission factors for different types of goods and services from environmental product declarations, which is obviously a bit of a compromise, but it would improve on spend-based emissions data. And then for works, 3 relevant tools were shortlisted. The EA carbon calculator had the highest hotspots activity coverage, and this was thought to be the most applicable to our organisation. The National Highways tool did actually score higher in the second step because it had better transparency in terms of the emission factors. Both of them were thought to be useful for NRW contracts and frameworks in our engineering, construction, maintenance and materials hotspots. And then the Woodland Carbon Code was the only tool that we identified that covered our forestry works hotspots. It was developed obviously for woodland creation projects and mainly for looking at sequestration estimates, but it does cover some useful emission sources, including forest road construction. I'm not going to go into services because they only actually identified 1 tool that was suitable for us. So the overall findings were, not surprisingly, there was no single comprehensive tool that could be used across NRW purchase types. The sort of development of a bespoke all-encompassing NRW tool wasn't recommended, obviously because of the complexity of the task. on because of the resource implications of doing so. Instead, they suggested we draw on the sort of suite of highest scoring tools. Obviously, this could become quite complex, so they suggested focusing on one or two sort of priority tools initially and piloting these based on any sort of opportunities that we identify in our procurement pipeline. Lots of other pieces of additional advice given, including that sort of to do this properly, we need more resource in our procurement team to support both our staff and our suppliers. Also that we shouldn't focus exclusively on tools, and this is just one strand of our supply chain decarbonisation plan that I mentioned at the beginning. If you'd like any further info, then please get in touch. These are our contact details.
Thanks, Anna. That was a really comprehensive presentation, and there were a few small contrasts there with Rob and the Welsh Government Energy Service that I'd love to pick up, but we haven't got the time to do so. But that's certainly a discussion we can be having after this particular session. So yeah, I was hoping you might come up with the answer, the holy grail. Here is the one tool that we can use for everything. Life's never that simple. We know it's a complex area, but your work sounds really quite far-reaching and is something I think will be of great value to the wider public sector. And we'll talk about potentially showing that a little bit later on with Warren. But now we're going to head over to Jenny, who's joining us over the phone. So that's great. And I can see you there very clear, Jenny. The only thing is you don't now appear in front of your presentation like other speakers. I don't know how that's been happening, but I've been very impressed by it. So we're going to hand over to Jenny Lloyd now from the Welsh Local Government Association. Jenny's been leading quite a significant programme of activity across local government. I'll be quiet now and hand over to Jenny. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And yeah, I am joining from the phone today and presenting from the screen. So if it looks like I'm just tapping you, it's because I'm using the tool on my screen. So so please bear with me as I'm going through the slides. But yeah, hi everyone, I'm Jenny Lloyd and I work for the Welsh Local Government Association on the Transition and Recovery Support Programme, which is the programme to help local authorities decarbonise and meet net zero by 2030. So I thought I'd just give a little bit of a background about where this project around sustainable procurement came from. So when the local government public sector roadmap was launched, we undertook deep dives into the 4 priority areas of land use, transport, procurement and building. So, we also convened the All Wales Climate Change Officers Group, but we had lots of feedback around, how can we do this? How can we meet these commitments? And how can we decarbonise in these 4 priority areas? So one of the projects we came up with was around sustainable procurement. And it was about meeting the commitments in Net Zero Wales, so in Carbon Budget 2, which would be to develop a good understanding by the end of 2022 of our procured goods and services and their emissions profile. So we would start to set out low carbon reduction sort of elements within our specifications when we're tendering for things, and that we would start to focus on some priority contracts. So that we've got some case studies and learning around how to decarbonise in these areas. So we work with our consultants on the task programme. We've got 5 consultants that work with us to undertake different research and produce tools. So we worked with Miller Research and Cilchog to look at what could we do to produce a toolkit around sustainable procurement. And there's a little bit of a screenshot of it there. You can see it's on an Excel spreadsheet, which would not create anything new, but bring together all of the existing guidance that's out there into sort of one easy to use place, so that when councils are looking to undertake procurement exercises, they can go to this toolkit and it's got specification guidance there and then links to other stuff as well. We also wanted to take a bit of a review of sort of the current state of sustainable procurement in councils, so that we could come up with some sort of clear recommendations then for how we could improve in terms of buying more sustainable things, lower carbon goods and services, but also improve our data collection in this area. And we wanted to provide some training as well on sustainable procurement. So that's what we started with. So in terms of the recommendations that came out of the report, so with our consultants, we met with stakeholders across local government, within Welsh Government as well, to come up with a list of recommendations. And some of these have already been mentioned today, so it's good that sort of we're all recognising the gaps and where we need to be in this space. But wanted to look, so some of the recommendations that came from the report were developing a standard classification system to enable data to be captured at that minimum contract level. So as the Energy Service and Welsh Government have mentioned, moving away from this spend-based data to getting real data around our contracts from our suppliers. That when we are reporting that they're developed and they're built into the existing tools that we use, when we're using eTender portal or we're using Sell to Wales, that the functions for collecting that data around the emissions of what we're procuring are built into it to ease that sort of, to support that data collection. So we carry on this ongoing dialogue and collaboration that we've all got with the Welsh Government, with NRW, with KEED now as well, so that we're sharing this best practice and we're working together using our resources. Sorry, my dog's just headed back into. And in the interim then, it's to sort of look at a consistent way of SIP translation. So previously it's been sort of, councils have been interpreting them in their own way, so that we can sort of try and streamline that and make it much easier for councils in terms of that translation. And then we also came up with some sort of strong, consistent recommendations as well for what councils can do in the interim while we're developing and moving forward on the data collection stuff. So there was some of these are to the early adoption of WPPN 0621 and requesting carbon reduction plans from suppliers. One of the key recommendations on that report was to, whereas at the moment we're asking suppliers for carbon reduction plans in contracts over 5 million, that we start to ask for them at a much lower threshold, which helps to send that really strong and consistent signal to suppliers that we're on this journey to net zero by 2030. And we want you to be on that journey with us by providing us with lower carbon goods and lower carbon services. And that we look at the introduction of a requirement for a validation for those CRPs, so ERM, like Green Dragon or ISO or something like that, so that we've got them verified and we know that organisations are also reducing their emissions. And then this is moving on to the toolkit. This is just sort of a bit of a snapshot of some of the guidance that we looked at when we were bringing together that toolkit. So it's got included in it guidance from RAP, guidance from the UN procurement programme, from Eco by Vienna. We've got some EU guidance in there as well. And then sort of moving from the economically advantageous tender to most advantageous tender by putting more of a requirement on sort of the quality and therefore sustainability aspects of the tender process. And then this is sort of a snapshot of that toolkit. So it's available on our website. You can download that and play around with it. You can see that we focused on the highest spend and therefore the highest emitting areas of council's procurement activities. So we've got things like construction, transport, manufacturing in there. And we've got guidance around the tender specification, and it's got links as well then to the original sources. So if you wanted to read more detail around it, what you can't see here, but if you click on that, it also comes up then with the recommended wording so that you can pick it up and then drop it into your tender documents. It's got sort of filters in it as well, so you can filter by contract size, you can filter by type, sort of like the sector that you're procuring in, to sort of narrow down that guidance and make it a little bit easier for you to look through. So just a bit of a recap then, like I mentioned before, we didn't produce any new guidance, we just sort of collated together all of the existing guidance that was in there into one place. So it's drawn from international good practice. It's got resources and references in there as well. It's got sort of sample criteria you can drop into it. And I think one of the things to highlight as well is that it's flexible. So you could, councils can input their own thresholds into it if they don't follow the ones that we've got in there. And that it's ambitious as well by building on that sort of that platform of WPPN 0621. It's taking that further and it's asking for more. It's asking for carbon reduction plans at a lower contract level, and it's asking for more sophisticated data as well from contracts. And then just to highlight our next stage of this work, so the toolkit and the report were launched in March. Let's say that out on our website for people to download and have a look at and use, make the most of, please do. And then the second stage is that we're currently working with our contractors to start a project quite soon of where we're going to be working one-to-one with a council or two councils on live tenders. So we'll be looking at this toolkit as well as other sort of guidance and stuff now that have newly sort of come out at the processes as well. So, things move fast in this area. I'm sure you're very well aware of that. To sort of handhold them and support them through this tender exercise, so that we can identify some gaps, we can identify challenges, and we can get some good case studies of how that toolkit works in action. That's it. There's my email there if you wanted to get in touch.
Super, thank you, Jenny. And I have to say, everybody is really meeting the 10-minute threshold for presentations. So we're doing really well. We might have the opportunity for a question or two at the end of the session today with the progress that's being made. Noted we've only had one question that's come up in the sidebar to date. So please do get your questions in. We will get back to you. So something that's crossed my mind, I mean, we've had a wealth of presentations in a very short space of time, and the concern is, after I leave this particular session, where on earth do I go to get this information if something from Anna has registered with me, or there's something I want to do, a bit of work around some of the elements that Jenny's described, or what were those findings from Rob and the Welsh Government Energy Service, and what else is going on over there? And it can be a bit of a tussle, try to find the right information. But that's why now we're delighted to introduce you to Warren Smith from Keed. And I'll let Warren tell you all about Keed, as I'm sure you're about to, Warren. But it's a community-led, when I say community, it's a procurement and commercial community-led Welsh Government funded initiative to effectively basically bring everything together to support us within the procurement and commercial community, bring everything together across all of these wonderful strands of work, bring it all together in one place, which hopefully should help alleviate some of my concerns about where can all of this be brought together a little bit after the presentation. So I'm going to hand over to Warren now to take us through a number of slides around Keed and the work on net zero.
Thank you, Paul. That was the most beautiful segue I've ever heard. So thank you for that. I think today it's a fantastic session because what we're hearing is all the effort that's going in across the Welsh public sector of people trying to focus on and doing good work in this area. So I think it's fantastic. And yeah, so thank you for that. So today I'm going to talk about new ways of working that we're helping to introduce with the aim of supporting the commercial and procurement community to implement Welsh procurement policies through their day-to-day work with an initial focus on net zero. And this includes applying these ways of working to support the improvements to carbon emissions reporting as well. So for those who don't know me, very briefly, my name is Warren Smith. I'm one of the Keed team, and we have been appointed to support what was initially called the Procurement Centre of Excellence pilot project, which is now known as Keed. So I think I've got control, and hopefully you can see the slide. So I just want to give a brief overview of what Keed is and what we've done so far for those who perhaps haven't been following. So we've partnered with a Welsh SME called Parago. I'm from a company called Kershaw. We're a commercial lifecycle consultancy, and our work began on this project in October last year. But there has been a lot of work and thinking already gone into this in terms of kind of consultation, and also a set of recommendations that came out of some reviews that were conducted by both the Future Generations Commissioner's Office and also a team of experts working on the foundational economy in Wales. And it was these drivers that led to an initial piece of discovery research into this area. And this was carried out by Upside Projects. So briefly, just on the name change, I'm not going to go into too much, but there was some feedback from the community that Procurement Centre of Excellence could be perceived as being somewhat elitist and not community focused, which is the ethos of everything that KEED is all about. And so we wanted to create a more collaborative and inclusive name that reflected the sentiments that we were getting through the feedback, but also that aligned with one of the key findings from the discovery research, which was that the project need to be community led, but centrally supported, which is both digital and non-digital in its very nature. So we wanted to make sure that the Welsh language led rather than followed in the creation of this new supportive community. And so that meant finding a name that would work in both languages, and also creating a brand that was Welsh at its core rather than being retrofitted once decisions were made. So following some research with the user community and also a number of workshops, the name and the branding that you see on the slides today was arrived at. And so full disclosure, I'm not a Welsh speaker, but I'm reliably informed that in Welsh, KEED means a joining, a coupling, a junction, a union, and a combination. So words that really sum up the kind of the collaborative and community ethos. And so KEED was born out of this. So just going back to the slide. How do I go over there? Right, sorry. It's in terms of the areas of focus, another finding from the discovery research was that KEED needed to be accessible to all stakeholders and enable capacity creation rather than being a drain on resources. And we know that everybody is restored through strain. So the last thing we want to do is to add to people's capacity there. So this is why we've been focusing on 3 key areas: sharing best practice, developing insight, and also supporting training. So in terms of the sharing best practice, our focus has been on designing, building, and testing a service for implementing policy through procurement, as well as sharing good practice around this. For developing insight, we focused on curating existing guidance, tools, and case studies, very similar to what Jenny mentioned. We know there's a plethora of information out there. The last thing we want to do is create more into this space. So this also means providing valuable lessons learned on policy enablement through procurement in terms of the insight piece, and also supporting training. Our focus has been on curating existing capacity building offers, both formal and informal, which could be used to widen the reach of existing capability development programs in Wales. In March this year, we launched KEED Rani, and this is a knowledge sharing series as part of how we're helping to develop those insights. And so far, we've welcomed guest speakers from the Basque government, the Republic of Ireland's Office of Government Procurement, and also the United Nations Specialised ICT Agency, the International Telecommunications Union, to share their recently launched procurement guidelines for smart, sustainable cities. Little plug, if I may, for next Wednesday's KEED Rani session will be joined by technology solutions provider Enterprise, and you can register to attend on the events page of the KEED.Cymru website. So another finding that came out of the discovery research was that development of KEED itself should start small with what's called a minimum viable product. So not kind of over-engineering stuff at this stage. And so this is why we've launched a temporary home for KEED, KEED.Cymru. In May, we received materials that have been produced by the Welsh Government in relation to the procurement journey. And this is based predominantly on what the Scottish Government have done. Currently, this is for below threshold procurements. And for the time being, we're using some legacy terminology of routes that may change through consultation with the community. And in addition to the routes, the procurement journey is broken down into 3 stages currently: develop at the pre-procurement stage, tender at the procurement stage, and contract at the post-procurement stage. And the phase 2 KEED website mirrors this information architecture, and we're now testing the content and the design with the community, and feedback from that testing will then support our iteration of the phase 2 KEED website in preparation for launch. Next slide there. So in terms of the methods, this again, we're tying everything to the findings that came out of the research and the discovery. KEED needs to be different from other services, such as the former National Procurement Service. This means that we're taking an approach that puts user needs at the center of everything we do and bringing people together to collaborate on common challenges. We embrace experimentation, the mindset around trying new things, and also using new tools and techniques to explore different solutions to those challenges. And it's through experimentation that we learn by doing things in a more iterative and incremental way, and always based on meeting the needs of our users. And so our methods align with the digital service standards for Wales, which are published by the Centre for Digital Public Services, CDPS. And these standards set out what's expected from new or redesigned digital services funded by Welsh public sector organisations. And actually point 9 within those standards talks very clearly about the importance of working in the open, which states that services built and the techniques used to build them should be made as open as possible. Services are developed by teams and who should communicate the decisions that they're making and also sharing what they're learning. So for us, working in the open is a really fundamental part of that. This is important because open and collaborative culture within and between public sector organisations helps share knowledge and also deliver more consistent services. This means being more visible both within and also outside of the organisation, such as through holding regular show and tell sessions or blogging about the journey that you're on, not just the end result. And working in the open also means celebrating the successes and being open about the learning from things that perhaps haven't worked so well. And actually this lunch and learn session is a great example of working in the open. So I'm delighted to be with you today. So moving on to the next slide. So applying these methods to improve reporting of carbon emissions data. Scrolling along. Our approach currently is to focus on one sector. So it's kind of thinking big about the problem, but focusing in on starting small. It's a really important way of making progress in a complex area. And this one sector that we're looking at the moment is social care, where a small number of local authorities have expressed interest in collaborating on a project focused on engaging social care providers. And this really chimes with everything that I've heard so far as part of this session. And this small group, beautifully formed, is coordinated by Welsh Government stakeholders from a number of different teams, including Kevin's area. And as he mentioned in his presentation, enhanced reporting to better estimate carbon emissions can be achieved using a range of tools to better record individual supply chain emissions, such as, in our case, the social care sector that we're focusing on initially. So our aim is to support collaborative development of new tools to ensure they meet users' needs and to iterate these tools based on the feedback where existing tools perhaps fall short of meeting those needs. And this should mean that we can build on what's currently, as already discussed, a largely SIC code-based proxy for emissions reporting and focusing on improved, in the first instance, improved tier 2 estimates on the path towards tier 3 actual emissions. In so doing, we'll capture insights and lessons learned and share these more broadly in support of our working in the open. We'll also look at how this could be expanded to other sectors of focus and to understand any specific nuances of their sector and test, iterate and retest accordingly. So certainly chiming with the point around not applying a one-size-fits-all approach, as mentioned earlier. So next slide. Finally, a quick update on user testing and another plug, if I may. So since April, we've been aligning with the team from an organisation called UBDS, who are also working on elements of the Welsh Government's Digital Action Plan for Procurement. We're currently planning to test a range of procurement-related digital tools that will eventually link to the KEED service. This includes the pipeline planning tool, as well as functionality and questionnaire content relating to what's called the policy mapping tool, incorporating sustainability risk assessments. I've already mentioned the development of work that's currently underway for the Phase 2 KEED website, and we're excited to see these various strands draw together more closely by applying the methods and the working practices of user-centered design, collaboration, experimentation, incremental and iterative delivery, and also working in the open. So, final slide, I promise, and just a call to action is all that remains to be said. So if you're not already part of our user test group and want to get involved, please contact us at the KEED Cymru website. Thank you very much.
Great stuff. Thanks, Warren. And perfectly timed. We've just got a couple of minutes just for me to thank all of our speakers. So a very big thank you to Kevin, Rob, Anna, Jenny, and to yourself, Warren, for taking the time out to join us today. That's a tremendous amount of information, all delivered in the space of 60 minutes. And of course, as we said at the outset, we're going to share the slides with everyone who's attended quite clearly. And of course, Rian will think about how we can make the actual session available potentially through KEED, which would seem to be a logical way forward. But I think Rian's just posted our mailbox there. So for those who've joined this session, but not through the Business Wales registration, we would have captured your details. So drop a note through to the commercial capability mailbox just appeared in the chat, and make sure that you're added to the list to get the slides. And finally, before I let everybody go, none of this would have been possible today without the work of Rian and Denise, and also Joe in the capability team. They've done a brilliant job bringing everything together, and we've not had any technical issues whatsoever. Notwithstanding, Kevin had a couple of slight issues at the outset there, far beyond the control of Rian and Denise there. But I just want to say a very big thank you to the capability team for making this possible today. And just to say, Rian, and I think if you just pop it in the chat, or Denise indeed, if you could just pop the details of our next event, which I think is going to be with Brendan Burke. And we're going to be talking about the sustainability risk assessment tool recently relaunched by the Welsh Government, which of course is part of the development work which Warren talked about, where we're going to be evolving that into an online policy mapping tool. So a lot of exciting things coming up, 2 other sessions as well, but we'll share that information as well as part of the slides that go out. So thank you to everybody. It's 12:59. I'll let everybody head off now for a 30-second lunch break before your next meetings. So thank you, everyone. Bye.